AB 2362 by Mr. Kansen Chu. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 2362 by Assemblymember Kansen Chu, an act relating to common interest developments.
Mr. Chu, you may open.
Thank you, Mr. Speakers and members. Assembly Bill 2362 would require a homeowners association to provide notification to owners and tenants in the common interest development if the association apply pesticides without a licensed pest control operator. Last year, the legislators approved and Governor Brown signed into law Senate Bill 328 by Senator Weasel, which added guidelines that landlords and property owners to properly notify their tenant if pesticides are applied to a non-licensed individual. Due to the unique way they are regulated under the state law, common interest development and homeowners association were not included in SB 328. AB 2362 seeks to close that gap and ensure that all tenants in property in California are protected from pesticides used via proper notification. This bill has no opposition. I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. Seeing no discussion or debate on this item, the clerk will open the roll. All members vote or desire to vote. All members vote or desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the vote. Ayes 73, no 0. Measure passes. File item 140 passed and retained. File item 141, AB 2613. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 2613 by Assemblymember Ashajian, an act relating to local government.
Mr. Ashajian, you may open.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present AB 2613, which will allow a special district with yearly revenues of $150,000 or less to replace their annual audit with a financial compilation with the unanimous approval of its governing board and the Board of Supervisors. This bill will give special districts in good standing the opportunity to utilize a less costly alternative while continuing to maintain the proper financial oversight and accountability.
Thank you, Mr. Ashajian. Seeing no discussion or debate on this item, clerk will open the roll. All members vote or desire to vote. All members vote or desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the vote. Ayes 75, no 0. Measure passes. File item 142, AB 2748 by Mr. Gatto. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 2748 by Assemblymember Gatto, an act relating to environmental disaster.
Mr. Gatto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, the residents of Porter Ranch had a really tough year last year. These families were faced with an environmental disaster that was really tough on them. Many of these families did not get to spend Thanksgiving at their house. Many of them didn't get to spend Hanukkah or Christmas at their house. And now these families find themselves with their biggest investment, their family home, which has gone down in value as much as 40%. And on top of that, their families are plagued with illnesses. And ladies and gentlemen, the residents near the Exide disaster have had a tough couple decades. They have faced a whole variety of health problems that particularly affect children. And they haven't always known what has been the source of this. And then we've learned in recent years that this has been the contamination near the Exide site. And these families have a really, really tough decision when they go into court. And that's because these companies are often asking them to sign away all claims when they go in for a settlement. So I want to stress that. If you go in and your oldest child has some health problems, you go in and you're suing, they ask you to settle and they want you to sign away claims for your whole family. So that parent is faced with a really, really tough choice of going in there and saying, I want to get justice for John, but Jane, they're going to force me to sign away all claims pertaining to Jane. In Porter Ranch, the company is actually asking the residents there to sign away future claims, meaning that if the well leaks again, these residents are going to have to sign away all liability. Think how crazy that is. Think how crazy that is for a minute. This legislation would prohibit those type of practices. It would also extend the statute of limitations by 1 year for these very, very hard to discover illnesses. We know what's been going on in Exide for a number of decades, but what the families in that community have not known is always the source of their child's ailment. Lead poisoning, ladies and gentlemen, manifests itself in many different ways. You might go into the doctor and you might say that your child is suffering from asthma, and you might find out decades later that it was lead poisoning from that plant. Decades later. And this is just extending the statute of limitation by 1 year, giving these families a little bit more time. This will also authorize the court to award reasonable attorney fees once a nuisance has been found, once a company has been found to be liable. Again, these families near a lot of these environmental disaster sites, they can't afford fancy attorneys. This is the only way that these families near the Exide site will see justice. This is a very, very important bill, and I ask for your aye vote. But I want to note a couple things, too. We've all seen a NASCAR letter going around this morning. You know, one of those letters that has all the stickers on the top of all the people who are outraged all of a sudden. This bill has been pending since December. They think by branding this bill with a certain label, they're going to come into our house and kill it, that we're going to ignore the pleas of these families for justice, that we're going to continue authorizing this weird situation in the law where homeowners in Porter Ranch have to sign away future claims for a future gas leak, where families in the Exide area have to sign away future claims for a second child because they branded this bill a certain way. Well, yes, we did have to expand this bill a little bit in the most recent committee. We probably expanded it a little bit more than I would have wanted, but that was what we needed. That was the will of that committee. And it's possible the Senate takes a bite out of it and reduces it a little bit, which is what happens through the process. But this is a righteous bill, and I ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Gatto. Mr. Stone, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I'd like to underscore how well balanced this bill actually is. Think about your constituents. Think about your own family. In a major environmental disaster and the emotions and the time it takes to figure out what's happening, you've been displaced from your home, you've been displaced from your schools, from your situation, and being forced to make very quick decisions. What this bill does is slow those timelines down a little bit to allow those families to actually assess what is happening and what's going on. It also gives some discretion to the courts to figure out what's appropriate on the attorney's fees situation. It's not automatic. It's up to the courts. And there's, again, some balance in the situation. I'll tell you, I do not understand the late opposition to this bill. There was none of the issues that were raised in the late opposition came up in committee, and we had a very balanced and fair discussion about what it represents and how we're going to protect our constituents in the worst situations they can find themselves in major environmental disasters like Exide, like Aliso Canyon. This is an appropriate step forward for this House to take. I want to compliment the author on bringing it forward and standing up for his constituents, as we all should. I urge an aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Stone. Mr. Wilk, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I want to thank the author of this bill for his leadership that he has shown on the Aliso Canyon gas leak situation. As chair of the Assembly Utilities and Commerce Committee, he's been a leader on this issue, and he has drilled in deep to expose what's been going on. However, unfortunately, I have to rise in opposition to this bill. This bill started as focused on the residents of Porter Ranch. In the Judiciary Committee, they greatly expanded it, and now this applies statewide, and it's a trial lawyer's dream bill, and it's just not appropriate. Environmental disaster, what is that? It's not defined. I think it's going to clog the courts. People are not going to be able to get remedies. I had a responsible bill, district focus, that was going to increase the statute of limitations for those residents within the area. The Judiciary Committee killed that. And when the author brought his bill forward, they hijacked that bill and they greatly expanded it. This will be a job killer bill. This will not allow people to get justice because it's going to clog the courts. And I strongly urge an aye vote. We can do better than this effort. No vote.
Thank you, Mr. Wilk. Ms. Grove, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition respectfully to this bill for basically the same reasons and a little bit more of my colleague from the Simi Valley area. You know, when we pass legislation on this floor based on the worst of the worst of the worst in our state, and we expand it to people that aren't the worst. We create loopholes in the law for trial attorneys and lawyers to be able to extort under the law monies from good companies or good organizations. By his own admission, no offense to the author, who is an attorney, said that this bill has been expanded further than he would want it to go. If this bill was only for the Aliso Canyon or the Porter Ranch area where there was actual damages done, where we need to stand up for those constituents, that would be one thing. But this bill expanded the way it is similar to PAGA, a Private Attorney General Act, and that piece of legislation was with good intent to limit employers from taking advantage of employees. But now that law has been circumvented by attorneys where 50,000 businesses in all of our districts are paying millions of dollars of fines for periods and commas or dashes and spaces on their paycheck stub because the law says you have to have a correct name. And so attorneys are winning litigation cases because a space in a name, like T space C construction, is not, I'll get to that, is not correct. So what I'm trying to explain is that law was passed with good intent. And I think this piece of legislation is passed with good intent to justify the constituents that were harmed in this environmental disaster. But to expand it over all the state of California, where they don't identify what an environmental disaster is, or they don't identify, just like PAGA, what is an incorrect or correct information on a paycheck stub, I think it creates a loophole for attorneys just to have a field day where they walk off with millions upon millions of dollars. The residents or the employees under PAGA get nothing or very minimal, and the state is just robbed for good businesses that are actually trying to do the right thing, that don't violate the law, but because the law is not clearly defined. I think reaction to these particular situations needs to be addressed, and these residences need to be restored, and there needs to be something done against the companies that perpetrated these acts. But to expand this statewide without clear definition of the law, you create loopholes for trial attorneys to make millions at the expense of these homeowners and our businesses, and I urge a no vote.
Mr. Santiago, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I want to first commend the author for his good work and maybe challenge the thought that expanding it was bad policy, because really, quite frankly, it's good environmental justice policy. And quite frankly, if it wasn't expanded, it wouldn't be encompassing my neighborhoods, which we all here voted a couple weeks ago to support AB 118. And I remember a lot of the conversation at that point in time was about the lack of accountability towards this company who was a polluter. And here we have the one opportunity to hold companies accountable. The one opportunity on the floor after many of my colleagues met with us about what can we do about a polluter who has thrashed my neighborhoods and polluted in the worst environmental crisis. And here's the one opportunity. And we've expanded this policy to be statewide because it absolutely makes sense. And it is not too much. It is not too much to extend the statute of limitations by 1 year. That's all we're asking here. And it is not too much to talk about an attorney fee. And it's contentious, I understand that. But listen for 1 second. In poor income communities, the challenges that we face about going after polluters is that if you're making minimum wage, and these are the neighborhoods that are typically polluted on, you don't have the money to put it up front to hire an attorney who is going to spend the time to go after a corporation who is a bad polluter. This only allows a very modest fee, but it gives the tools to neighborhoods up and down the state to go after polluters. And I would challenge the idea that this is a giveaway to attorneys. No, quite frankly, it's not. This only provides a small tool in a long fight against environmental polluters. And I would congratulate the author, because if bills like this were in place in my neighborhoods, it would give us an opportunity to challenge. And I'm hoping that when this bill does come into place, it'll give us an opportunity to challenge. We have now had 33 years of a fight in this neighborhood. And this author here wants to give us 1 more year and to give us tools to challenge the worst environmental polluter. And yes, hold them accountable for the things that they have done. So I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak and would respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Santiago. Mr. Wagner, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I do rise in opposition. Probably no surprise there. I'm not going to go into too much of the merits, or shall I say, demerits of the bill. You've heard from my good colleague from Bakersfield on that. Those problems are there. The bill is a lot more expansive. You heard from my good colleague from the Santa Clarita Valley again about how the procedurally this was sort of hijacked and has become much, much more than it started out to be. I do, though, need to rise to correct something that was suggested and perhaps was not intended to be suggested, because the author, of course, is a very experienced business lawyer and knows this to be the case. When a 1542 waiver, which is the civil code waiver, is applied in a settlement, it does not, and you have no need to concern yourselves with the idea that such a waiver will prohibit any homeowner or any injured family or any injured person from suing if the well blows out again, because that's not how 1542 waivers work. All they say is you're waiving your claims as to damages for a particular instance. You've cut a deal with the bad guy. You've got a settlement agreement in place. We've had certainty in the law, and 1542 waivers have been in the law since before anyone on this floor was born. The fact of the matter is they provide certainty in the law. Let me give you a quick example. If somebody slugs you and you sue them for the damages for getting slugged, and you're satisfied with the solution, you're satisfied with the settlement, you're satisfied with the money you get, you sign a 1542 waiver. That doesn't mean they can come along and slug you again. It only means you can't sue again for the prior bad act. So with respect to what happened in Porter Ranch and what happens in any environmental claim, don't kid yourselves. We're not asking the polluters, or giving the polluters a get-out-of-jail-free card. That just is not how 1542 waivers work. And if that's the intent of this bill, first of all, I don't think it's clear in the language, but second of all, it is an enormous increase in scope of these waivers that, again, have been settled in the law. And to take that step now would be way too big a step for this legislature to take and would unsettle decades and decades of civil practice. I think for that reason alone, and if the author is correct about what this bill does, this deserves a no vote and a rethinking on that policy ground.
All debate having ceased on the measure, Mr. Gatto, you may close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I greatly respect the gentleman from Irvine and his comments, but I beg to differ. I've been very close to these disasters, and I've actually read the waivers that they're asking people to sign. And those waivers, first of all, it's not settled law, and second of all, those waivers do say any claim, known or unknown, in the future, in the past, etc., and they go into great detail about second environmental disasters. Number two, somebody said that that the term environmental disaster was not defined in the bill. Again, that's not the case. We're talking about after you have found liability for private nuisance. Folks, you know how hard it is to prove private nuisance? It's already a very high bar. There have been cases of people polluting rivers so much that the rivers light on fire, and you still can't prove private nuisance. There have been cases of drug dealers next door, and it's hard to prove. Lead being dumped near a shooting range, that has not been adjudged a private nuisance. So this is a very tough bar, and this is for the worst of the worst in terms of environmental disasters. And I really ask that question, I guess. Why would we not want this to apply statewide? Why would we not want, when somebody does something so bad to a community, why would we not want that community to gain justice? That's what I don't understand. And you have to ask yourself that too. If there is an environmental disaster, if somebody can prove that there is a private nuisance to a jury, to a judge, why would we not want to give those families some relief? And lastly, I'll address this label job killer. It's kind of funny to me because giving families relief does not kill jobs. It never does. It makes them whole after what they've suffered. You know what kills jobs? Polluting a community and then having to declare bankruptcy and shut your plant down. That kills jobs. I ask for I vote.
Thank you, Mr. Gatto. With that, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. 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 Mr. Gatto. Mr. Gatto moves the call.